Most accounts of the Weimar hyperinflation treat it as an exceptional event, a freak accident of history brought on by the unique conditions of post-World War I Germany. The truth is more unsettling. What happened between 1919 and 1923 was not a sudden catastrophe, but a step-by-step process, each stage following logically from the previous one, each decision seeming reasonable at the time to the officials making it. Germany did not wake up one morning to find its currency worthless. It walked there gradually through phases that began with wartime borrowing, moved through moderate inflation, accelerated into crisis, and ended in hyperinflation so extreme that a loaf of bread cost billions of marks and prices doubled every 2 days. The progression was methodical, and disturbingly, several of those early stages are visible today in the fiscal and monetary policies of major economies that have embraced massive deficit spending, central bank balance sheet expansion, and the implicit guarantee that governments will never be allowed to default on their debts. The first step toward hyperinflation was taken long before the Weimar Republic existed. During World War I, Germany financed its war effort primarily through borrowing rather than taxation. The government issued war bonds and accumulated debts of 156 billion marks by 1918, a sum far exceeding the country's pre-war GDP. The strategy was based on the assumption that Germany would win the war and force the defeated Allies to pay reparations that would cover the debts. Treasury Secretary Karl Helfferich told the Reichstag in 1915 that it was the Allies who deserved to bear the financial burden. When Germany lost, that calculation collapsed. The debts remained, but the anticipated revenue to repay them vanished. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, added insult to injury. Germany was required to pay £6.6 billion in reparations, equivalent to more than $585 billion in modern terms in gold or foreign currency. The Weimar Republic, born in November 1918, inherited this impossible situation. It faced massive debts, a devastated economy, political instability, and reparation demands it had no realistic way to meet. In May 1921, the Allied Reparation Commission fixed the total obligation at 132 billion gold marks. The German government, already struggling, now had to find ways to make payments in foreign currency or goods like coal and timber. The problem was that Germany did not have sufficient gold reserves or export capacity to generate the foreign exchange required. The solution chosen by policymakers was to print more marks, use them to buy foreign currency on international markets, and then make reparation payments in that foreign currency. This set in motion the core dynamic of hyperinflation, increasing the supply of domestic currency to meet external obligations, driving down the currency's value, which in turn required printing even more currency to buy the same amount of foreign exchange. At first, the inflation was manageable. In the immediate post-war years, prices rose, but not catastrophically. The mark depreciated, but it still functioned as money. People adjusted to higher prices, and the government kept printing to cover its deficits and reparation payments. For a brief period in the first half of 1922, the mark even stabilized at around 320 marks per dollar. International conferences were held to find solutions. One, organized by J.P. Morgan Jr. in June 1922, aimed to restructure the debt and stabilize the currency. But the meetings produced no workable agreement. The political will to impose austerity was absent, and foreign creditors were unwilling to forgive debts. The structural problem remained. The government needed revenue it could not raise through taxes, so it kept borrowing from the central bank, which kept printing money. The second phase began in mid-1922, when inflation accelerated into something more dangerous. Political turmoil, including the assassination of Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau, shattered confidence. The mark fell to 7,400 per dollar by December 1922, and the cost of living index increased nearly 17-fold in 6 months. Hyperinflation expectations became unanchored. People who had assumed the currency would stabilize began to realize it would not. The forward exchange premium and behavior of foreign speculators indicated that the earlier phases of inflation had been largely unexpected. But by late 1922, the future trajectory was becoming clear. When inflation expectations shift from "this is temporary" to "this will continue accelerating," the psychology of money changes. People stop holding currency and rush to convert it into goods, real assets, or foreign exchange as quickly as possible. The third phase, from mid-1922 through November 1923, was the hyperinflation proper. In January 1923, French and Belgian forces occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, to enforce reparation payments. The German government responded with passive resistance, ordering workers to strike and promising to pay their wages, even though production had stopped. This required printing even more money. By December 1922, the mark had fallen to 4.2 trillion to $1. By November 1923, the exchange rate reached 4.2 trillion marks to $1, and in some accounts, the peak was even higher, with $1 worth over 4 trillion marks. 400 quintillion marks were in circulation. Prices doubled every 49 hours. Workers were paid multiple times per day and rushed to spend their wages immediately because by the next day, the purchasing power would have halved. The social and economic consequences were catastrophic. The German middle class, which had saved in mark-denominated bonds and bank accounts, saw its wealth wiped out. A lifetime of savings became worthless paper. Pensioners who had relied on fixed incomes found themselves destitute. Workers carried wages in wheelbarrows and suitcases. Anecdotes from the period capture the absurdity. A man in Hamburg ordered 2 cups of coffee at 5,000 marks each, but by the time he finished, the price had increased to 7,000 marks per cup, so he was charged 14,000 marks for the second coffee. Children used bundles of banknotes as building blocks. People wallpapered their homes with currency because it was cheaper than buying wallpaper. Bartering replaced cash transactions. Farmers refused to sell food for marks and demanded payment in goods or foreign currency. Urban populations faced hunger as the monetary system that connected producers and consumers broke down. The hyperinflation ended abruptly in late 1923, not because the underlying fiscal problem was solved, but because a new currency was introduced and the government committed to stop printing money to finance deficits. On November 15, 1923, the Rentenmark was launched. It was not backed by gold. Germany had no gold left, but by a claim on the productive capacity of German land and industry, essentially a mortgage on the country's real assets. The new currency was issued at a fixed exchange rate of 1 Rentenmark to 1 trillion old marks. Critically, the government also blocked the Reichsbank from printing further paper currency to finance spending. The combination of a new currency and a credible commitment to fiscal discipline broke the inflation psychology. People began to believe that the Rentenmark would hold its value, and that belief made it so. Within months, prices stabilized. The hyperinflation was over, but the social and political damage was irreversible. The destruction of middle-class wealth and the trauma of economic chaos contributed to the political extremism of the late 1920s and early 1930s, setting the stage for the rise of totalitarianism. The Weimar experience offers a clear template for how hyperinflation unfolds. It begins with a government that borrows heavily, expecting future revenues or external conditions to solve the problem. When those expectations fail, the government faces a choice: impose austerity and default on obligations, or print money to cover deficits. Printing money is politically easier in the short term, so that path is chosen. At first, the inflation is modest and seems controllable. Policymakers and economists argue that it is temporary, that it can be managed, that the real problem is insufficient demand or external shocks, rather than excessive money creation. But as deficits continue and money printing accelerates, inflation expectations begin to shift. Once the public loses confidence that the currency will hold its value, the spiral becomes self-reinforcing. People spend money as fast as they receive it, driving up prices, which forces the government to print even more to cover the same real expenditures. The end game is either hyperinflation or a wrenching stabilization that wipes out debts and savings. Modern economies insist that this cannot happen to them. They point to differences. Weimar Germany was a defeated nation with reparations obligations and limited policy tools, while today's advanced economies issue debt in their own currencies, have independent central banks and sophisticated financial markets, yet the parallels are harder to dismiss than officials would like to admit. The United States, Japan, the United Kingdom, the Eurozone, and others have engaged in quantitative easing on a scale unprecedented outside wartime. Central banks have created trillions of dollars, euros, yen, and pounds to buy government bonds, effectively monetizing fiscal deficits even if the mechanism is more indirect than the Reichsbank printing marks. Public debt levels in many advanced economies now exceed 100% of GDP, levels that were once considered unsustainable. The argument made by proponents of modern monetary policy is that quantitative easing is not the same as money printing, because the newly created reserves sit in the banking system and are not directly spent into the economy. This distinction held as long as inflation remained low. But after the pandemic fiscal response and the inflation surge of 2021 through 2023, the assumption that central bank balance sheet expansion has no inflationary consequences looks shakier. Critics of QE warned for years that it was helping to fuel asset bubbles and risked causing broader inflation if velocity of money increased. When supply chain disruptions and fiscal stimulus combined with years of accommodative policy, inflation jumped to levels not seen in decades. Central banks insisted it was transitory, then were forced to reverse course and tighten aggressively. The parallels to Weimar's early phases, when inflation was dismissed as temporary and manageable, are uncomfortable. The key question is whether advanced economies can exit the cycle of debt monetization without triggering either runaway inflation or a deflationary collapse. So far, they have managed to avoid both extremes, but the path is narrow. High public debt levels mean that governments are sensitive to interest rate increases, which raise debt service costs and worsen deficits. Central banks face pressure to keep rates low to avoid fiscal crises, but doing so risks reigniting inflation. The Weimar lesson is that once a government becomes dependent on money creation to finance itself, the options narrow. Stabilization requires a credible commitment to stop printing and to restore fiscal balance, but such commitments are politically painful and often come only after a crisis has destroyed confidence in the currency. The Rentenmark worked because it came at the end of a catastrophe so severe that the public was desperate for any solution. Whether modern democracies can summon the political will to stabilize before reaching that point remains an open question. For now, they are further along the Weimar path than they were a generation ago, and each step forward makes the next one harder to avoid. The mechanics of how hyperinflation destroys an economy go beyond simple price increases. Weimar Germany's experience revealed how monetary chaos dismantles the entire structure of production, trade, and social cohesion. As the mark lost value, the system of contracts and long-term planning that underpins any modern economy collapsed, Employers could not offer meaningful wage contracts when prices were doubling every few days. Landlords found rental agreements worthless as tenants paid in currency that had lost most of its value between the signing of the lease and the payment date. Banks stopped making long-term loans because the money repaid would be worth a fraction of what was lent. The calculus of every economic decision became impossibly short-term, focused on converting currency into anything tangible before it depreciated further. One of the most devastating effects was on capital formation and investment. Businesses could not plan for the future when they had no idea what their inputs would cost next week or what their revenues would be worth when collected. The natural response was to stop investing in long-term projects entirely. Why build a new factory or expand production capacity when the currency you would receive from future sales might be worthless? This led to a vicious cycle. Reduced investment meant lower productivity, which meant the economy generated less real output, which made the existing monetary overhang even more destabilizing. Germany's industrial output fell sharply during the hyperinflation years, not because factories were destroyed, but because the monetary system that coordinated economic activity had broken down. The distributional consequences were equally brutal and revealed deep fault lines in society. Those who owed fixed debts benefited enormously as hyperinflation effectively wiped out their obligations. A mortgage that once represented years of income could be repaid with a single day's wages by late 1923. Landowners and industrialists with physical assets weathered the storm relatively well as real estate and industrial equipment retained value while paper money evaporated. But creditors, pensioners, and the middle class, people who had saved in bonds, life insurance policies, and bank deposits, were devastated. The very virtues that societies typically encourage, thrift, saving for the future, deferred gratification, were punished. The social contract that promised savers they could store value safely for retirement or emergencies was shredded. This bred resentment, radicalism, and a deep mistrust of institutions that would poison German politics for a generation. The political dynamics of hyperinflation are also instructive for understanding modern risks. Governments facing fiscal crises always have a choice: impose austerity, raise taxes, cut spending, and accept the political pain, or print money to cover deficits and delay the reckoning. The Weimar government chose the latter path repeatedly because the alternatives seemed worse. Cutting spending would have meant laying off public workers and slashing benefits in a country already destabilized by defeat and revolution. Raising taxes on a population that had just endured 4 years of total war was politically untenable. Defaulting on debts or refusing to pay reparations would have invited military occupation and further humiliation. So the government printed money, and each round of printing made the next round necessary. The hyperinflation was not a policy anyone chose. It was the cumulative result of many smaller decisions to avoid immediate pain by deferring costs into the future. Modern governments face structurally similar incentives. Central banks have become enablers of fiscal deficits by creating demand for government bonds through quantitative easing, allowing treasuries to borrow at rates far below what markets would demand without intervention. Politicians in democracies respond to voters who demand services but resist higher taxes, creating structural deficits that can only be financed by either cutting entitlements or finding creative ways to print money. The term quantitative easing sounds technical and benign, but the functional result, central banks creating reserves to purchase government debt, is uncomfortably close to what the Reichsbank did for the Weimar government, even if the transmission mechanisms differ. The Weimar officials also believed they were acting responsibly, using the tools available to manage an impossible situation. The lesson is that hyperinflation is not caused by evil or stupidity, but by a series of decisions that each seem rational in isolation but compound into catastrophe. Another parallel lies in the way officials dismissed early warning signs. Throughout 1921 and into 1922, German economists and policymakers argued that inflation was caused by external factors, reparations, speculation against the mark, the balance of payments, rather than by domestic money printing. They pointed to the fact that the money supply increase lagged behind the currency depreciation, suggesting that depreciation came first, and money printing was a response rather than a cause. This debate mirrors modern arguments about whether inflation is driven by supply shocks, corporate greed, or demand-side fiscal stimulus, rather than by monetary expansion. In Weimar, the argument was ultimately settled by events. When the government finally stopped printing money in late 1923, inflation stopped. The causal link was clear in hindsight, but policymakers spent years in denial because acknowledging it would have required painful choices they were unwilling to make. The stabilization itself offers lessons. The Rentenmark succeeded not because it was backed by gold, it was not, but because its introduction was coupled with a credible commitment to fiscal discipline. The government balanced its budget, the central bank stopped monetizing deficits, and people believed the commitment would hold. Confidence, once lost, can be restored, but only through actions that demonstrate a genuine break from past policies. This suggests that the path out of debt-driven inflation, when it eventually comes for modern economies, will require not just technical fixes but political transformations, a willingness to prioritize currency stability over short-term expediency, to accept recessions and unemployment rather than print money indefinitely, and to rebuild trust in institutions that have been eroded by years of policy improvisation. The Weimar Republic achieved that stabilization, but only after the hyperinflation had already destroyed the savings and social fabric of a generation. Whether today's policymakers can act before reaching similar extremes remains one of the central uncertainties of the coming decades.